2:09 a.m. Gulf Standard Time. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest is 33 nautical miles wide. Through that 33-mile gap moves approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil per day, roughly 20% of global petroleum supply, 30% of all seaborne crude, transiting a waterway flanked on the north by Iranian territorial waters and on the south by the territorial waters of Oman and the UAE. Every tanker in that channel follows two designated shipping lanes, each 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile median. The lanes are charted, published, and enforced by International Maritime Convention. They are also the most analytically predictable maritime choke point on Earth, which means every party with an interest in controlling the strait has spent decades planning operations against exactly those lanes. At 2:09 a.m., 3 elements of that planning executed simultaneously. From 4 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast attack craft operating without running lights in the southeastern approach corridor to the strait, 47 self-propelled influence mines were released into the northbound shipping lane between positions 26 degrees 31 minutes north and 26 degrees 44 minutes north. The mines were bottom influence type. They would sink to the channel floor, activate their magnetic and acoustic sensors, and wait. At the average draft of a very large crude carrier, a single mine detonation in the keel zone represented a probable mission-disabling event. The IRGC had placed 47 of them across a 13 nautical mile corridor in less than 19 minutes. Simultaneously, from coastal launcher positions on Qeshm Island and at Bandar-e Lenge, 61 Noor and Qadr anti-ship cruise missiles launched on bearing toward the carrier strike group operating in the Central Gulf, 190 nautical miles northwest of the strait. The missiles went feet wet immediately, skimming at 6 meters above the surface on inertial guidance, radar seekers in acquisition standby, navigation locked on their assigned terminal coordinates, and from pre-surveyed IRGC ballistic missile positions in Fars and Bushehr provinces, 22 Fateh 313 solid-fuel ballistic missiles launched on trajectories toward 2 targets: the Ras Tanura crude oil processing facility on the Saudi Arabian eastern coast, the single largest petroleum processing facility on the planet, handling approximately 7% of global daily supply, and the Aramco east-west pipeline pumping station complex at Abqaiq, which processed an additional 7%. Together, those 2 facilities represented 14% of the world's daily crude oil supply. The IRGC's operational assessment held that confirmed impacts at Ras Tanura and Abqaiq would trigger an immediate $40 to $60 per barrel price spike, generate sufficient economic and political pressure on the U.S. and its Gulf partners to force a negotiated ceasefire before any conventional military response could be organized, and validate the IRGC's deterrence narrative for the subsequent decade. Total simultaneous action: 47 influence mines in the Hormuz northbound lane, 61 anti-ship cruise missiles inbound to the carrier group, 22 Fateh 313 ballistic missiles targeting Saudi petroleum infrastructure, 3 separate threat categories, 3 separate defensive responses required, all activating at the same moment. The IRGC had not designed this as a strike to be won militarily. They had designed it as a strike to be won economically and politically. The first 72 hours of oil market reaction, not the first 60 minutes of military engagement, were their measure of success. The military action was the trigger mechanism for an economic event they assessed as unavoidable once the strait's navigability was in question. Oil markets do not wait for mine clearance assessments. They price risk immediately. The flaw in this calculation was the same structural error that had characterized the prior IRGC strategic assessment: the assumption that the complexity of a 3-vector simultaneous operation would divide U.S. defensive attention sufficiently to allow at least one vector to achieve its intended effect. Their modeling held that the mine threat would require immediate commitment of mine countermeasure resources that would reduce the forces available for active defense. Their modeling also held that 61 cruise missiles against Aegis defense would produce a statistical penetration rate of 8 to 12%, 5 to 7 hits against the carrier group. Their Fateh 313 ballistic salvo against Saudi infrastructure was assessed as the least defended of the three vectors, since no Patriot battery was within range of both Ras Tanura and Abqaiq simultaneously. The mine assessment was partially correct. The cruise missile penetration assessment was based on single-ship Aegis modeling. The Fateh 313 targeting assessment did not account for Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had repositioned to the eastern province 12 days earlier, following precisely the intelligence indicators that had also elevated U.S. forces to increased readiness. At 2:09 a.m., the space-based infrared system detected the Fateh 313 launch plumes simultaneously across the Bushehr and Fars province positions. The alert reached CENTCOM at 2:09 a.m. and 42 seconds. The carrier's Tactical Flag Command Center had already flagged the cruise missile launch signatures. The IRGC fast attack craft had been under passive surveillance from a P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft for 37 minutes prior to the mine release, and the moment the craft shifted from their observed drift pattern to active navigation headings, the P-8's tactical coordinator had transmitted a warning to the carrier group. The carrier group had been at heightened defensive posture for 4 minutes before the first cruise missile lifted from the Qeshm coast. 4 minutes was not a large margin. It was sufficient. The Aegis cruiser at the group's southern perimeter had 61 cruise missile tracks on its display at 2:11 a.m., all assessed as Noor or Qadr class, all on acquisition bearings toward the formation. The CEC network distributed the engagement assignments across 4 ships simultaneously. No duplicated targeting, no wasted interceptors. SM-6 dual-mode interceptors began engaging the outermost tracks at 2:12 a.m., working the salvo from the leading edge inward. The engagement geometry favored the defense. The cruise missiles were maintaining constant altitude and bearing, their radar seekers still in passive mode at that range, their terminal acquisition not yet triggered. At 6 meters altitude over calm water, the radar cross-section presented by a Noor anti-ship missile was small but not invisible to the Aegis SBY radar operating at its surface search sensitivity setting. 44 of 61 cruise missiles were neutralized in the outer and mid-range engagement zones. 17 reached the inner defensive perimeter. CIWS on 3 destroyers and the cruiser engaged simultaneously. 12 more were neutralized at close range. 5 penetrated. The carrier's own CIWS engaged 3 of those 5 at ranges between 600 and 1,100 meters. 2 were neutralized. The third was neutralized at 380 meters, close enough that the crew felt the pressure wave from the detonation through the ship's hull. The flight deck watch went prone. Nobody was hurt. The CIWS operator's hands were on the override switch and did not leave it until the track disappeared from his display. He was 22 years old. His engagement log showed 0.9 seconds between track detection and rounds on target. The system's designed response time was 1.4 seconds. He had preempted it by half a second on manual override, a reflex that his training had built over 14 months of drills he had conducted 340 times without a live target. The 4th and 5th penetrators targeted the destroyer on the eastern screen. The destroyer's CIWS engaged both. One was neutralized at 710 meters. The 5th closed to 290 meters before its seeker lost lock. The destroyer's onboard jamming system had been activated as a last resort measure when the engagement queue exceeded the CIWS allocation. The seeker loss caused the missile to nose up and impact the water 190 meters off the destroyer's starboard beam. The water column reached the ship's bridge wing. The watch officer, standing on the bridge wing at the time, received salt water in the face and a fragment laceration on his left arm from debris. He returned to the bridge, had the laceration dressed by the corpsman, and returned to his watch position. He did not log the injury until the engagement phase was complete. The ship was undamaged. 5 penetrators. 0 hits on U.S. naval vessels. The Fateh 313 ballistic salvo against Saudi petroleum infrastructure encountered the repositioned PAC-3 MSE batteries in the eastern province at 2:14 a.m. 16 of 22 Fateh 313 tracks were engaged and intercepted in the terminal phase over the Gulf Coast and the desert approaches to Ras Tanura and Abqaiq. 4 more were engaged by a U.S. Aegis destroyer operating in the northern Gulf that had been tasked with ballistic missile defense coverage of the Saudi eastern coast following the intelligence assessment elevation 12 days earlier. 2 Fateh 313s were not intercepted. The first impacted the Ras Tanura facility at 2:17 a.m. It struck the facility's secondary crude stabilization unit, not the primary processing infrastructure, but a secondary complex whose function was acceleration of throughput during surge operations. The warhead detonated on impact. Significant structural damage to the secondary stabilization unit. Fire suppression systems in the adjacent areas activated within seconds. The primary processing infrastructure was undamaged. Ras Tanura's operational capacity was reduced by an assessed 11% pending repair assessment. Not 7% of global supply, not a market-disrupting event, but a confirmed impact on a Saudi petroleum facility that would generate exactly the media coverage the IRGC had designed their strike to produce. The second Fateh 313 impacted open desert 2.3 kilometers northeast of the Abqaiq perimeter. Terminal guidance had been partially disrupted by the Growler electronic warfare package that had been active since 2:11 a.m., targeting the IRGC's ground-based fire control data link frequencies. The warhead detonated in uninhabited terrain. No facility effects. By 2:19 a.m., 10 minutes after first launch, the active missile engagement phase was complete. 61 cruise missiles, 56 neutralized, 5 penetrators, 0 U.S. hull hits. 22 Fateh 313s. 20 neutralized, 2 impacted Saudi territory, 1 with limited facility effects, 1 in open terrain. The mines remained. The Hormuz northbound shipping lane mine threat was a different operational problem from anything in the defensive engagement sequence. Mines cannot be intercepted. They cannot be jammed or electronically suppressed. They are neutralized through one of 2 methods: clearance, which requires MH-53 airborne mine countermeasures helicopters or MCM surface vessels operating in the minefield, a process measured in days for a 13 nautical mile corridor, or rerouting, which closes the shipping lane and triggers the economic event the IRGC had designed their operation to produce. CENTCOM executed neither option immediately. Instead, at 2:22 a.m., CENTCOM transmitted a NOTAM, Notice to Airmen and Mariners, closing the northbound shipping lane to commercial traffic pending mine clearance assessment. Simultaneously, the Mine Countermeasure Task Element pre-positioned in Bahrain received deployment orders. 3 MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters and 2 Avenger-class MCM vessels began their transit toward the strait at 2:24 a.m. The MCM vessels' estimated time to the minefield, 9 hours. The helicopters, 2 hours 40 minutes to the nearest confirmed mine positions. At 2:22 a.m., oil markets in Asian trading, which had been open for 6 hours, received the NOTAM. The price reaction was immediate. Brent crude moved $12 per barrel in 14 minutes. This was the one metric by which the IRGC's operation had achieved a measurable effect. Not the carrier group, which was intact and flying strike packages. Not the Saudi facility, whose primary infrastructure was undamaged. Not the shipping lane itself, which was closed but not permanently compromised. The market reaction. The CENTCOM Counter-Operation Execute order had been transmitted at 2:16 a.m., 7 minutes after the first IRGC launch. The priority target set was the IRGCN mine-laying capability and the coastal missile batteries, not because the cruise missiles had succeeded, but because leaving those capabilities intact created a persistent threat to the strait that extended the NOTAM timeline and therefore the market reaction. Every hour the strait remained under threat was an hour the $12 price spike remained or grew. The economic damage was a function of timeline. Reducing the timeline was the operational objective. A-18G growlers that had been suppressing IRGC fire control data links since 2:11 a.m. shifted their jamming priority at 2:17 a.m. to IRGCN, coastal radar, and communications frequencies, the sensors that guided the fast attack craft operating in the lower Gulf. Without coastal radar coverage, the 4 fast attack craft that had laid the minefield were operating blind. They knew their approximate position. They did not know the position of the U.S. Navy vessels now closing on them. Tomahawk cruise missiles from the submarine holding station in the Gulf of Oman entered the strait at 2:20 a.m. on inbound trajectories toward 3 target sets: the Qeshm Island coastal launcher infrastructure, the Bandar-e radar, and communications nodes that provided targeting support to the coastal missile batteries, and the IRGCN fast attack boat facility at Bandar Abbas that housed the reserve mine-laying capability. 26 TLAMs in flight. First impacts at 2:38 a.m. F/A-18E Super Hornets from the Carrier Air Wing launched at 2:18 a.m., armed with Harpoon anti-ship missiles and JSOW glide weapons, assigned to the IRGCN fast attack craft still operating in the lower Gulf. The craft had identified the Carrier Air Wing launch through their passive radar detectors and were now attempting to transit south toward the Omani coast. Outside the operational area, outside the engagement authorization, where they could claim innocent passage and complicate the rules of engagement picture. The transit attempt was assessed and the engagement authorization was confirmed by CENTCOM at 2:21 a.m. By 2:29 a.m., all 4 mine-laying fast attack craft had been engaged. 3 were rendered non-operational on the water. 1 had reached the edge of the Omani territorial water boundary and was assessed as non-operational by its own crew. The engagement authorization had been confirmed before the craft reached the boundary, and the weapons had already been released. All 4 hulls were confirmed non-functional. The 4 fast attack craft represented the entirety of the IRGCN's immediately available mine-laying capability in the strait. The reserve capability at Bandar Abbas received its Tomahawk impacts at 2:41 a.m. The facility's operational status was assessed as significantly degraded. The IRGC's ability to extend or deepen the minefield in the Hormuz corridor was eliminated as an operational factor. At 2:38 a.m., the first Tomahawk impacts on Qeshm Island neutralized the remaining coastal launcher infrastructure. The Bandar-e radar and communications complex followed at 2:43 a.m. IRGCN coastal surveillance capability along the Northern Strait approach was reduced to passive optical systems, functional for observation, non-functional for weapons targeting. The Fateh 313 launch sites in Bushehr and Fars provinces were addressed in the second wave of the counter-operation. B-1B Lancer aircraft that had been holding airborne alert east of the strait since 11 p.m. released JAS-SMER cruise missiles against the mobile launcher positions at 2:19 a.m. using targeting data from F-35C aircraft that had been in the sensor-to-shooter role over the Gulf since before midnight. 31 JAS-SMER releases against 22 confirmed and 9 assessed launch positions across the 2 provinces. By 2:47 a.m., 18 of the 22 confirmed positions had been engaged with assessed results of operational degradation. The desperation element of the IRGC's operational sequence activated at 2:33 a.m. The IRGC Aerospace Force Command, Recognizing that the minefield had been publicly acknowledged through the NOTAM and that the market reaction was occurring but the military sequence had failed, transmitted authorization for a second anti-ship missile salvo from reserve coastal positions at Jask, positions that had not been part of the primary strike package, held back specifically for this contingency. 33 Quadr cruise missiles from Jask. A salvo the initial U.S. targeting package had not addressed because Jask's reserve status had not been confirmed until 2:29 a.m. through signals intelligence. The carrier group's CEC network flagged the Jask launch signatures at 2:34 a.m. 25 minutes of warning. The group had expended significant SM-6 ready load during the first salvo engagement. The engagement commander assessed remaining interceptor inventory against the 33 inbound tracks and determined that the outer engagement zone would be handled by SM-6, the inner zone by CIWS, and that 2 destroyers would need to conduct emergency VLS reload sequencing during the engagement to maintain coverage depth. The emergency reload sequencing required both destroyers to temporarily reduce their own ship defensive coverage to minimum while the automated reload cycle ran. The coverage gap was filled by cross-assignment through the CEC network, other ships absorbing the tracks that the reloading vessels could not address. It worked. It worked because the CEC architecture had been specifically designed for this scenario. The 2 destroyers completed their reload cycles within the engagement window. The engagement proceeded without a coverage gap. 28 of 33 Jask cruise missiles were neutralized in the outer and mid-range zones. 5 reached CIWS range. 4 were neutralized. The 5th impacted the ocean 220 meters off the carrier's port bow, guidance disrupted by the carrier's onboard jamming in the final approach phase, the missile's seeker unable to reacquire the hull at terminal velocity. The impact generated a water column visible from the carrier's bridge. The ship was undamaged. By 3:01 a.m., 52 minutes after first IRGC launch, the active missile engagement phase of the combined operation was complete. The minefield remained in the Hormuz northbound lane. The MCM task element was en route. Time from first launch detection to end of active engagement phase: 52 minutes. IRGC weapons employed: 61 Noor and Qadr cruise missiles, first wave; 22 Fateh 313 ballistic missiles against Saudi infrastructure; 33 Qadr cruise missiles, Jask reserve wave; 47 influence mines deployed in Hormuz northbound lane. Total kinetic weapons: 116 missiles and 47 mines. Missile intercept rate: first cruise wave, 91.8%, 56 of 61. Ballistic intercept rate: 90.9%, 20 of 22. Missile intercept rate, Jask reserve wave: 87.9%, 29 of 33. Combined kinetic intercept rate across all missile categories, 90.5%. Effects from non-intercepted weapons: 0 U.S. naval vessels hit. 1 Ras Tanura secondary processing unit with confirmed impact. 11% throughput reduction, primary infrastructure intact. 1 Fateh 313 in open desert terrain, 0 facility effects. Hormuz northbound lane closed pending MCM clearance. Estimated 96-hour full clearance timeline. Counter-operation weapons deployed: 26 Tomahawk against IRGCN coastal infrastructure and Bandar Abbas reserve facility. 31 JASSMER against Fateh 313 launch positions, Harpoon and JSOW against IRGCN fast attack craft, AARGMER against coastal radar nodes. Total distinct offensive weapons: 74. IRGCN fast attack craft, all 4 mine-laying hulls non-functional. Qeshm and Bandar-e-Lenge coastal missile infrastructure neutralized. Bandar Abbas IRGCN mine reserve facility operationally degraded. PAC-3 won 3 launch positions. 18 of 22 confirmed positions assessed operationally degraded. U.S. assets, 0 naval vessel hull hits. 1 CIWS operator manual engagement at 0.9 seconds within spec. 1 watch officer minor laceration, return to duty. Carrier air wing fully operational throughout. PAC-3 MSE Saudi Eastern Province. Ready load at 67%. Economic effect of mine deployment. Brent crude moved $12 per barrel in the 14 minutes following the NOTAM. By the time the MCM task element reached the minefield at 11:40 a.m. local time, the price had returned to within $4 of pre-operation levels as analysts assessed the facility damage as limited and the mine clearance as proceeding. The IRGC's 72-hour economic pressure window had not materialized. The market had priced the counter-operation as efficiently as it had priced the threat. Total U.S. munitions cost, $780 million. Estimated value of IRGCN and IRGC infrastructure operationally degraded, $2.4 billion. Exchange ratio, 1 to 3.1 in U.S. favor. The IRGC had designed their operation around a sequence. Mines create economic shock, cruise missiles create naval shock, ballistic missiles create infrastructure shock, and the combined shock generates political pressure before a military response can be organized. The sequence required all 3 elements to achieve measurable effects within a 12-hour window. One element produced one effect, a temporary oil price movement that reversed within hours. The naval and infrastructure shocks did not materialize. The minefield was cleared in 89 hours. The northbound shipping lane reopened at 3:22 p.m. on the 4th day. Ras Tanura's secondary stabilization unit was assessed as requiring 6 weeks for repair. The primary infrastructure had operated at 89% capacity throughout. The $12 per barrel price movement had become a $2 per barrel premium by the time the lane reopened. 52 minutes of active engagement. 4 days of mine clearance. 6 weeks of secondary facility repair. 1 watch officer with a laceration on his left arm who returned to his watch position before logging the injury. The Strait of Hormuz was open. It had been designed to stay that way.